Hey folks, Dust here, and I decided to make a video because ESEA LAN is currently going on right now. And in ESEA LAN, obviously, we have had all the North American teams already eliminated. So while the LAN is still going on, obviously the story for the NA teams is already over. And of course, we recently had the CEVO LAN as well as some of the North American teams. And so what I wanted to do was kind of just do a State of NA CSGO episode again, where I just kind of talk about where the NA scene seems to sit right now after these two LAN events, as well as some other recent events that some of the teams have played in prior to ESEA LAN as well. In the past, I've always kind of really focused in on the small details, you know, focusing on every single game that they've played and the mistakes they've made in each game and stuff like that, and kind of just breaking down their matches one by one and kind of doing more of a recap than focusing on big, general, broad ideas. So in this video, I'm not going to do that. I'm gonna focus more in on the more, you know, general trends. I'm not going to break down every single game. I'll mention them, but I'm not going to go into heavy detail about who did what wrong and when and why. If you want to go watch my analysis from CEVO LAN, you can see some of my discussions about CLG and Nihilum and Luminosity there, where I do pick apart their matches because I was working the analysis desk there. You can check out those VODs on the Major League Gaming YouTube. But here I just want to focus on some general trends. And I'm going to start out with CLG. I'm going to start with the teams that were at CEVO LAN. Obviously, Cloud9 was not, so I'll come to them kind of last. But I'll definitely timestamp all of these. That way you can go, you know, look at whatever team you wanted to look at whenever you want. So CLG is a team that has always been plagued by issues with inconsistency, and obviously there was also a big uproar when the POV strains came out for Katowice about potential issues with leadership and communication. What I mean by that is this. So when CLG was coming up at the end of 2014, they started making a statement for themselves because of the Aspen qualification process. So they were, you know, upsetting teams like Torqued and iBuyPower back when they had Hiko and the NA Dream Team was forming by, you know, eliminating them and being the first team to qualify for Aspen since Cloud9 had direct invitation. And obviously when it came to the second team, there was like a fill-in where Liquid had to fill in because of the whole iBuyPower banning situation, even though they qualified out of the second qualifier, but whatever. So the point is CLG really starts to make a name for themselves here when they're qualifying for Aspen. Now once they get to Aspen, they continue to make a statement for themselves whenever they were able to beat LDLC, what is now Envious, on Dust 2 in a really close 16-14 game, mostly off the individual efforts of Peter, but also just some good reads on T side from some of the scouting that they did on that team, and the fact that LDLC or Envious now didn't really have much of a read on them. However, they completely, you know, pissed that all away basically by just getting absolutely smashed by Liquid on Cash. I believe it was like a 16-3 game. Just really got smashed. And Cash was actually usually a pretty good map for them. That was a map that they were able to beat Torqued and iBuyPower on throughout the qualification process, and just in general they looked pretty strong on that map. And even at some of these LAN events we're about to talk about, they had some pretty good Cash games. So this is just a sign of the inconsistency, able to get a big win here, but then a big loss here, so that they get past the hard part, so to speak, to advance some groups, but then they lose to a North American rival in a crazy one-sided fashion on a map you feel they should be pretty powerful on, based on their online results, at least at that particular time. So they don't advance out of groups from Aspen. You know, then obviously, you know, they gear up for Katowice during the qualification process for that. They're able to beat Titan on Dust 2 in another very close game. So once again, getting a big win against a big European team on Dust 2. And because of that, they also, I think they beat Gamers 2, like a Polish team, on Cash, and they qualify for Katowice. Then once they get to Katowice, they have the crazy comeback win against Hellraisers on Nuke. So once again, another big win against a big European team. But then they get absolutely crushed by NIP on Mirage. And then they got absolutely destroyed by Keystars on Dust 2, a map that they can beat big teams on. We've seen them do it, but then they just absolutely get decimated by the Brazilian team Keystars. That double out setup from Keystars just kind of ripped them apart. So once again, you know, some inconsistency there. You know, big wins, but also big losses, and also once again not able to get out of group play. Now, part of in this inconsistency is obviously, like, people point to Tarek, because he does have big games, like against Titan at the Katowice qualifiers. You know, like during the Aspen qualification process, that did quite well, but he also had some off maps too, where, you know, especially like at Aspen on that Liquid match. Of course, the whole team did poorly against Liquid, but the point is that Tarek is kind of one of those players for them that has been somewhat inconsistent. leading up into the CEVO LAN and ESEA LAN. Cutler has been kind of the rock of the team, very consistent. But everyone else needs to have highs and lows. I mentioned Tarek, but Peter, you could say the same thing with his op. Some games very, very good, like against, Envious at Aspen, but other games just not really seeming to have as much of an impact. So some inconsistency there as a team in results, and then some of their players also. And Hayes himself even alluded that this was a problem. He felt his team was kind of a 50-50 team. They would have big wins, but also big losses, just like I said. And so the team even seems in agreement with this particular problem going forward. Then obviously criticisms came out after the POV streams from Katowice, where when we're listening to the communications against Nip on Mirage or Keed Stars on Dust 2, they didn't seem to be on the same page. People were asking, what are we doing? Even though they said they had a lot of good preparation, it seemed like it didn't really shine through in their actual T-sides. Like I said, it seemed like people weren't on the same page. They weren't executing together as a team. It seemed like a lot of people going off and doing things by themselves, or there was just uncertainty on what to do, like pre-round in the freeze time. People are asking, hey, what are we doing? And, there's kind of a lot of hesitation there. So that was another big issue, is people seem to see issues with their leadership and communication, like lack thereof when it comes to leadership. And then communications were either just completely jumbled, or they just wasn't very productive communication. Now, I will say this, coming into CEVO LAN, they looked much better on their T-sides, obviously. They beat that Elevate Pug with the Hiko and Skadoodle, largely based off of some really strong T-side play on Cash and Dust 2. On Cash, I think they got 12 rounds or something like that on T-side against Elevate, and then on D2 in regulation, they had 13 rounds on T-side. And then overtime, they kind of struggled there, but eventually closed that out. Now against Nihilum on Cash, once again, very strong T-side on Cash against Nihilum. That was kind of big for them. On Inferno, they had a huge CT side, which is what you expect on Inferno, but then they allowed a crazy comeback from down there and almost, had to play a mat 3, but they eventually did close it out, I believe, actually, in overtime, if I'm not mistaken. If it wasn't overtime, I think it was overtime, actually, there. Then in the grand finals, once again, against Elevate, they actually lost Cash, but they were able to win D2 and Nuke to actually win it. So they actually finally won their first LAN title. So things seemed to turn around. Tarek was playing well the entire event. He wasn't having an event where he would, have a good map and then fall off the rest of the tournament, or have one good best of 3 and then fall off the rest of the event. He played well throughout the entire event. I could say the same for most of their players, really. Cutler, obviously, a huge consistent player, played really well throughout the whole event. Hayes as well. Peter didn't really seem to have, horribly off games. Maybe he wasn't the shining star from the Envious game at Aspen, but he played well throughout the whole event. Everyone really did well this whole event. However, there were some issues, and it was their CT sides. Their CT sides looked very, very poor. In all their series, basically. Like I said, for instance, in the upper bracket game against Elevate, they won 13 rounds from T-side in the second half to make a comeback to force the overtime, because they had only been able to get 2 rounds on CT side in the first half. So they had to make a crazy comeback with 13 rounds on T-side and then win it in overtime. So definitely some struggling there on the CT side. Same can be said whenever they beat Elevate on Cash in that same exact series. Yes, they got off to a great start on T-side with 12 rounds, but then they allowed Elevate to make a bit of a comeback. They struggled on the CT side to close out that game. And then when you look at their other best of 3s in this same tournament, like for instance against Nihilum on Cash and Inferno, on Cash, once again, struggled on their CT side, even though they had a really good T side. On Inferno, the problem there is they had a great CT side. I think they won 13 or 14 rounds on CT side first half, but then once again just struggled to close the game. So I think you could make a general argument that they just struggled to close games, I think would be, no matter what side apparently, but usually it's the CT sides they struggle on, except for really CT heavy maps like Inferno, like Nuke. They obviously are still able to capitalize very well on the CT side. Now, when you bring them to the ESEA LAN, they get O2'd by Fnatic right off the bat. Really no surprise there. They're not ready to beat an elite team like that yet, even though they are showing some signs of improvement, because at CEVO LAN on the T side, they seem to be more on the same page. Their timings seem better. They seem to be executing better as a team. They seem to be, working grenades properly and timing their peaks with grenades very well. So it seemed like they actually did improve kind of some of their teamwork and communication on executions, but their CT sides just seemed lackluster, to be quite honest. And also, to be honest, the competition at this CEVO event was not nearly as high at previous events. That they're not playing against the same caliber of teams at CEVO LAN as they were when they were playing at Katowice or other events. So it's almost as if they should have won. They were the favorites from the get-go at that tournament, and it would have just been a big disappointment if they hadn't and took in first. So basically, it wasn't a grand accomplishment. They just did their job. That was what they were supposed to do. Now, granted, I'm not going to take that away from them. They did make the accomplishment. They they finally won a LAN title, but it was in a circumstance where some of the other top NA teams like Cloud9 and Liquid weren't even present. Elevate's full team wasn't even present. It was a pug. Sure, it had a lot of firepower, but it was a pug. You had a team like Nihilum, who we had no clue how they were going to perform. You know, they didn't have any LAN experience, really. And then Luminosity, obviously, was just off of an in-game leader roster change, and they had looked pretty poor online prior to this event anyway. They hadn't won a single FACEIT game in that league. So, like I said, everything was set up for CLG to win that event quite easily, and they did so. So they did their job, and they did look better on T sides, but their CT sides definitely look bad. When you come into ESEA, like I said, they got 0-2'd by Fnatic. You know, that wasn't a really big surprise. They were able to 2-0 LG quite easily. Once again, not a very big surprise. But then it came down to this Mouse Sports game, a European team that North Americans have had success beating in the past, specifically Cloud9 at previous ESEA LANs, if I'm not mistaken. But they lose this. And when they lose this game, some of the problems that they had seem pretty reminiscent of problems they've had in the past when they have gotten knocked out in group play and other events. And it was that Tarek was kind of having an off game, especially on Dust 2. This didn't look like himself. And I would actually say Cutler, actually the guy who's usually most consistent for this team, all of a sudden struggled in this particular series, which is one of the first times I've really seen him struggle throughout an entire series. Usually, yeah, other people might be struggling, his team as a whole might be struggling, but typically he's always kind of that second or third place fragger on the team, no matter what's going on with Tarek or Peter or whoever else. But he seemed to actually really struggle this series, and I don't think that's something that's going to continue to happen. Maybe he just had an off series, but I will say that the big issue here is, once again, their CT sides looked really, really poor throughout this event. They really did rely on T sides, with the exception of their 2-0 against LG, where they pretty much, you know, did everything they needed to do on both sides of the map, no problem. And then against Fnatic, what do you expect? They're likely going to lose to Fnatic. Obviously, that's, you know, the best team in the world. But when it came to this Mouse Sports game, once again, struggling on their CT sides. And that was one of the biggest reasons why they lost out against Mouse Sports and got eliminated from the tournament, was because of these poor CT sides, as well as some of their big players. Cutler, who's usually very consistent, having an off series, and then Tarek, you know, one of their big players they rely on, that did so well throughout the entire CEVO LAN event, has had good bats in the past against big teams like Titan at the Katowice qualifiers, for instance, or even he was a big part of their comeback against Hellraisers at the Katowice main event, playing that CT side on Nuke at the upper bomb site, playing really, really well. So he had an off game here, too, in the series on Dust 2, and so I guess basically what you could say is this, is there's still issues with consistency on this team, especially with players like Tarek, who can usually be very good, but still does occasionally have off match, and that's going to happen. You can't be perfect your entire way through, but it seems to happen in the most important instances, like when they're on the verge of finally breaking through and really upping their status. I think their status is already upped just by the sole fact that other teams have dropped off, and they have done well enough to kind of stay in the top of NA. Winning CEVO lane obviously helps. That puts them ahead of some of the other top 5 teams of NA. Head-to-head against Cloud9, we've still never really seen that happen on LAN, I don't think. I can't recall a time I've seen that happen on LAN where they played the best of 3 on LAN, so kind of hard to gauge those two teams against one another. And since Elevate didn't play with their full 5 at CEVO LAN, it's kind of hard to gauge them against them as well. And obviously Liquid isn't even present, so it's kind of hard still to fit them into the NA rankings, but they did seem to at least improve on some of their T sides, and they have gotten a little bit more consistency. But I would say consistency is still a bit of an issue on this team, and I would also say their CT sides just looked abysmal, to be honest, throughout both these events. They really relied on T sides to have the success that they had, so they need to work on those CT sides for sure, and then hopefully just through time they'll develop more consistency, I guess. But basically, I wouldn't say any roster changes need to happen on CLG. I just think that maybe they can still work a bit on their communication. Obviously, they need to go back to the drawing board on their CT sides, and we'll see what goes from there. When it comes to Nihilum, there's not a whole lot to say here. All I really will say is that they were pretty impressive. I mean, we had no clue what this team was going to be like when they came into CEVO LAN. 2 of their players, like, you know, Sanxington and Professor Chaos, didn't have like any LAN experience whatsoever. Automatic's LAN experience in CSGO was pretty limited as well. Same, you could say the same for Valens. I guess Flowsick was really the only player on that team that had a decent amount of LAN experience. Obviously, as a 5, 0 LAN experience together as a 5. So, a lot of inexperience, decent online results. I mean, they qualified for these events like ESEA and CEVO. They had some big best-of-1 wins in the regular seasons of these leagues against some of the other top NA teams, but no LAN experience, so we had no clue what they were going to be like. They show up to CEVO LAN, they 2-0 Luminosity right off the bat, pretty one-sided games. You know, T-sides look good. I think they won 9 rounds from T-side in both maps they played against Luminosity, and then closed down TT side quite easily. So immediately you can tell that Automatic's playing really well, Sexton's playing really well, Professor Chaos is playing really well. Basically, they're living up to their skill pretty much from their online results. Like, they're basically proving they're not online, that they can bring it online, that they can perform up to the same standards as they had set based on their online play. I mean, that really shined through here at LAN. So you can tell that immediately. Then they get 0-2'd by CLG in the upper bracket finals, but they're close games. Like, I think Cash, when they lost there, was like a 16-13 game, and Inferno, it went to overtime. So they challenged CLG actually quite well. One of the big top NA teams, they challenged them quite well in the upper bracket finals. Now, granted, a lot of the reason why it became so close in this series is CLG made a lot of mistakes on Cash from their CT side, as I was alluding to their poor CT side earlier. Stupid mistakes, like getting the bomb down. There was one particular round I can remember where they got the bomb down way back in A lobby on Cash, like by the stairs to like T spawn. There's where the bomb was down. And one of the Nihilum players was in a 1 versus 2 at this point, and Tarek is playing inside A lobby, and I think it was Finesse or someone else is playing like highway, like at mid. And the Nihilum player's inside the A-bomb site. Now, all that has to happen here is Finesse can just fall back all the way through mid-garage and meet up with Tarek in the bomb, and then they just hold the bomb, and the round's going to be over that way. That or Tarek just falls really passive, and they could probably win the round off of 1 versus 1. Well, what happens? Finesse keeps challenging through highway, gets caught. Dead. So now it's a 1 versus 1. Now, instead of Tarek falling back to the bomb and just playing the clock on the bomb, he pushes like all the way aggressive towards the lockers and tries to play a 1v1 aim battle and loses. So it's little stupid things like that CLG were doing on their CT sides that just didn't make any sense, and it led to a really close series. But not to take anything away from Nihilum, they played quite well. Like I said, their T sides were on point throughout the entire event, and they definitely lived up to the hype that they had created from their online play, for the most part, I'd have to say. Now, after losing to CLG, they do get absolutely crushed by Elevate. This seemed like kind of an outlier because of how well they performed against Luminosity and CLG at the event. And then obviously later we see how they play at ESEA. Of course, we didn't know that while we were at CEVO LAN that they would do well at ESEA. But the point is if you take these two events as a whole, it almost seemed like getting crushed by Elevate was an outlier because they got 16-0'd on Mirage. That was crazy. And then they lost 16-4 on Dust 2. To get eliminated from the tournament by Elevate in the lower bracket final. I mean, they looked abysmal in these two games. Obviously, they got 16-0'd and 16-4'd, so I mean, obviously they look very poor. And Elevate just were hitting them so fast, though. I mean, I don't think they were ready for the tempo that Elevate brought to the games against them, I guess. I mean, Elevate was just constantly in their faces and rattling them. And, yeah, so they did look quite poor against Elevate. There's no doubt about it. But then they come into ESEA, and they play Virtus Pro first. Yes, they get 0-2'd, but they challenged pretty well on Inferno, actually. They got 9 CT rounds, which is pretty respectable against an elite-level European team when you're kind of like a no-name North American team just starting to make a name for yourselves. And then they got 4 rounds on T-side, and then they lost that game 16-13. So they actually challenged on at least one of the maps against Virtus Pro in the upper bracket. They get knocked down to the lower bracket. They immediately 2-0 Cloud9. Once again, Sexton and Automatic are looking very good, just like they looked at CEVO LAN. Professor Chaos dropped off a little bit against higher competition as opposed to CEVO LAN, but he was still playing pretty well. And in general, the team was, looked pretty sharp, especially Sexton and Automatic, on that 2-0 there against Cloud9. Now, they still wound up getting eliminated from the tournament, but my point is they lived up to their hype from online. They performed at about... Actually, they probably overperformed because I don't think anybody expected them to be as good as they were at CEVO LAN as they were, being able to, beat Luminosity, challenge CLG, and then at ESEA challenge Virtus Pro, eliminate C9 from the tournament in a 2-0 series, where a lot of their players that didn't have a lot of LAN experience, especially players like Sexton and Professor Chaos, and even to a degree Automatic, all looked pretty good. So I would say that if you're Nihilum or you're a Nihilum fan, you have to be somewhat proud of your performances at these events, just because this is the first 2 LANs they've ever played at as a 5, and for some of their players it was their first ever LANs period, or at least, maybe they played some local stuff against local competition, but against like major North American teams or international competition, first time ever having done so for pretty much all 5 of their players, yet they actually challenge, Virtus Pro on a map, and they 2-0'd C9. So it's one of those things where you can't be too disappointed in Nihilum. I think they performed quite well. Now, I will say they're in this dangerous position now because it seems like there's probably some roster changes probably going to take place in the NA scene. And I think that some of Nihilum's players are quite poachable, so to speak. I think players like Unimatic and Sexton could be players that some of these teams are looking at to poach. And so maybe this team doesn't survive that NA roster shuffle process. But if it does, if they can grow a bit, maybe there's something there. I don't really know. We'll have to see. But I think some of their players did look quite promising. I thought their performance was quite promising given the situation they were in with the limited LAN experience. I'll talk about Luminosity really quick. I did a whole video about their whole in-game leader roster swap with Arya coming in for Hades, and I kind of took both sides of that argument, weighed the pros and cons, and I kind of concluded that I thought that they probably should have waited after these events to make an in-game leader roster change, but they felt that they needed to make it then and there so that they could have hopefully an immediate impact and actually have an immediate good performance on LAN, since they weren't going to get to play on LAN for a few more months until next ESEA and CEVO LAN events, I guess, since they're not really going to go overseas right now. Anyway, point is, they didn't do well. I mean, that's kind of quite obvious, right? Now, to be honest, it's not as if I didn't expect this to happen, so I'm not really surprised at all. Going into CEVO LAN, I thought they might be able to beat Nihilum in the upper bracket just because I had no clue what Nihilum was going to be able to do on LAN. It became quite clear now that we've seen Nihilum play both ESEA and CEVO LANs that they're actually quite good on LAN, especially against domestic competition, and at least are challenging on certain maps against European teams. So now, in hindsight, it's not that surprising that Nihilum was able to beat them 2-0 in CEVO LAN. But going into the event, I guess that was a bit of an upset, a bit of a shocker, just because Luminosity did have more experienced players, and at least some people thought that they had some more talented players, even based on online stats. Like Anger had crazy online stats in comparison to some of Nihilum's players. Regardless, they do get 0-2 there by Nihilum, and then they got 0-2 by Elevate, which even though Elevate didn't have their full 5, by the time that they got to Luminosity, they had worked out all the kinks that they had in their first best of 3 against CLG. They were looking a lot sharper. Obviously, Skrull's op was on point throughout that entire series and throughout the entire event after they met CLG in the upper bracket. Hiko woke up after that initial best of 3 against CLG as well and was looking sharp. Desi, I mean, everybody was on point for Elevate. And so, basically, my point is this, is nothing about Luminosity's losses are very surprising. Getting maybe 0-2 by Nihilum was a bit surprising when you didn't realize how good Nihilum was going to be on LAN, but now in hindsight, it makes perfect sense it happened that way. Elevate's win against them on CEVO makes perfect sense. Obviously, they weren't going to beat Titan at ESEA LAN, not as well as Titan had been playing lately with the ESL Pro League LAN that they had just played at recently, where they looked really good and made the final. And just in general, they have talented players that you expect to be able to beat a team like Luminosity on LAN. They actually did challenge, though, and I think they got OT against Titan on Cash, and Anger actually looked kind of good in that map in comparison to the rest of the events, but that one thing is not going to save your tournament or save your status, so to speak, and so it just wasn't enough. And then they get 0-2'd by CLG quite easily to get away from the tournament. So basically, between CEVO LAN and ESEA LAN, they played 8 maps, and they lost all 8 maps. And this comes from Nihilum, Elevate, Titan, and CLG. So basically, they got nothing accomplished. But I would say it doesn't really matter. I think they walk away from these 2 events in the same position they were when they walked into them, which is a team that's probably like 5th or 6th place in North America, and they're still at 5th and 6th place in North America. They didn't do anything to work themselves up the rankings, and they didn't really, like I said, the teams they lost to were teams I thought they'd lose to. Regardless of who their in-game leader was, I figured they would lose to Elevate, Titan, and CLG. So, it is what it is. Yes, they didn't do anything to help themselves, but they fall right where I thought they would be, to be honest. I mean, I think teams like, obviously we're going to talk about Cloud9 here in just a second and where they're at, but I think even still teams like Cloud9, obviously Nihilum, obviously CLG, Elevate, even with their normal 5, I think, did I say Liquid, all those teams are going to be ranked above Luminosity prior to these events and after these events are over. That's basically it. Luminosity had an opportunity to maybe establish themselves as being higher ranked than some of these other North American teams, but they didn't. And that's just the bottom line. And yeah, so there's not really much. There's not much to say about Luminosity. They're kind of, I wouldn't say they're irrelevant, but they're not challenging for a top 4 spot in NA, and they obviously don't really have any international aspirations right now. So besides challenging one map against Titan and putting it to OT, they really did nothing between these 2 events to advance themselves, and that's just the cold hard truth. So now we're going to get to Cloud9, then we'll also entertain this idea of what Hiko's doing with the team as well at the very end. So Cloud9, right? I've done 2 videos on them already. I did one video about the end of 2014 and into 2015, so I'm not going to harp on all those facts again. You can go check out that video. Also did another video about them, kind of criticizing their play at Katowice and kind of breaking down and analyzing their matches at Katowice and what went right and what went wrong. So once again, I'm not going to do that and rehash that again. You can go watch those 2 videos, and it'll give you all of my thoughts and my analysis of that team and all those events that they played at the end of 2014 and beginning of 2015. So I'm not going to rehash that, but I would say that for what I'm about to say, for it to make sense to you, and so you can see where I'm coming from and what I'm saying, you probably should go at least check out the video I did about them at Katowice, because a lot of the problems that I brought up in that video analyzing their games at Katowice are some of the exact same problems I feel like they still have that need to be fixed, basically. So definitely check that out. I will review really quick that obviously at Katowice they were able to get that win against TSM on Nuke, which was big. Then they lost to Virtus Pro on Inferno, and then they lost to TSM on Overpass. Going into the Gfinity event, they were able to beat Orbit in best of 3, not back-to-back best of 3s, but they were able to beat Orbit in 2 best of 3s to advance from like group play at that event. But along the way, they played VP in 2 different best of 3s, I think once in group play and once in bracket play. In those 2 best of 3s, they were only able to get 1 map off VP, but then they lost overall in the 2 best of 3s. Then, of course, they lost the best of 3 against Envious in group play as well. So basically, to just at least review like the problems I felt, I'm not going to rehash the matches, but some of the big problems that people came up with were Shazam. And no, I'm not jumping on this damn bandwagon that Daze has created when he did his 2 videos about their games against TSM on Overpass and Inferno with VP and break down every single mistake that Shazam made. I'm not on that bandwagon. In fact, if you go look at my YouTube channel and you look at the date that I published my video about Cloud9 at Katowice, and you go look and see when Daze published his videos on the Netcode Guide's YouTube, I guess, about his criticisms of Shazam, you'll see that I posted my criticisms much earlier than Daze did. I'm not saying that anyone copied anybody. I'm just saying that the mistakes were so glaringly obvious that anybody that looked at those games could have found them, and we both did, even though we did so at different times or whatever. So no, I'm not jumping on some type of bandwagon. I have my own criticisms about this particular Shazam situation before Daze ever posted anything. Now, you have to understand that I was of the camp that, okay, you bring in Shazam. I honestly thought the investment wasn't smart to begin with. I mean, when they picked up Shazam, the only thing that he had really done to kind of earn a spot on the top team was like play really well at the last ESEA LAN event when he was playing with Denial. But outside of that, he had never really done a whole lot to really kind of earn a spot in a elite or top NA team. But slim pickings right now, right? Because Skadoodle was off limits at the time that they picked up Shazam. A lot of people I keep saying, oh, they should just pick up Skadoodle. I just got Skadoodle. They couldn't. I'm sure maybe they would have liked to have. But you have to understand that in this situation, Skadoodle was still tied up with this North American Dream Team with like Dazed and Hiko and all the iBuyPower guys. You know, they hadn't been banned yet after that ESEA LAN when Cloud9 was shopping around for a new player to replace Hiko. That's the big deal there. So Skadoodle wasn't an option. Not only that, but there was not many options out there for an opper, which is what they wanted, which made perfect sense for some of the issues they were having with roles on the team where no one really wanted to op and they were bouncing it around. They needed a dedicated opper. So it made sense to pick up an opper. And like I said, slim pickings on who's out there. You had Shazam, who had a big event at ESEA, so do you go with him? He was showing some potential. I think a Dren could have maybe been an option because this was prior to him getting picked up by Liquid. Or at least what turned into Liquid. I think they were still Denial at the time that they picked him up, but then turned into Liquid. Other than that, there's not many other operas out there they could have gotten, to be honest, with Ska off limits, and like it pretty much just left Shazam, Adren, maybe JDM. Peter's off limits, he's on CLG, so there's slim pickings there. So I guess I can understand the situation they were forced into to bring him in. And also, I'm usually of the philosophy that you shouldn't cut players until you exhaust all of your resources, until you plateau. Once you've done everything that you can do with your 5 and you're still not getting anywhere, you've plateaued, unless you're satisfied where you're at with that plateau, or if you're slumping, you're falling off, then at that point you seem to have no choice but to change teams, change rosters, because I mean, that's just it. You've exhausted all of your resources. You've done everything you can do with the file that you have, and you're still not attaining your goals. You're still not growing. You're not seeing an upward trend. You're not seeing potential. There seems to be a lack of silver lining because you're either just plateaued for so long, or you've begun to fall off. And so I think now is that time. It's the perfect timing to make this change because they're not going to FACEIT LAN in May anyway. So I feel like they at least have a month or so before they're going to go to another LAN event. I think there's like another Gfinity event. I don't know if Cloud9's going to that one or not. That's coming up soon, but you know, definitely not going to FACEIT at the beginning of May. So they have at least 3 or 4 weeks to kind of make a change and work with it a bit before maybe they go to a Gfinity event. And obviously they're going to have some online league play coming up for, you know, CEVO Season 7 and whatever, you know, whenever the next season of ESEA starts. But they have a good break right now to start making changes now. Maybe they didn't have time prior between like ESEA LAN and Gfinity and Katowice to make changes, but now they do have that time to at least consider that option, and they should, because they have exhausted their resources. They have hit that plateau. In fact, they've begun to fall off, and so now is the time to make a change here, and I think that Shazam has to be the change. You know, the guy does have pretty damn good aim. He does have the occasional map where he does look like he belongs on that team. He has good performances at times, for sure. But you can also point to just a plethora of decision-making mistakes that he has had throughout the majority of these tournaments he's played at for Cloud9, especially Katowice. Obviously, Dave's broke them down in his videos, but I did too. I didn't show you a video representation of those plays. I just talked about them, and I did so prior to Dave's video, so I don't want you to think I'm jumping on some type of bandwagon there. I saw them myself. They were pretty obvious at Katowice. You even look at this ESEA LAN, there were many occasions in post plants where he overpeaked and kind of gave a free kill to a retake, or just different things like that. The decision making just doesn't seem to be there for him. And at first, when he first got picked up for this team before Katowice, I thought, okay, yeah, maybe Shazam lacks some experience and maybe he does have some issues with decision making, but maybe he can be coached. Maybe he can be developed. Maybe with, you know, a lot of experienced players surrounding him and through practicing and scrimming and dry running and things like that, maybe he'll come around. Maybe he'll develop into a better player. But it's been a few months since then, and it doesn't seem like he's developed much. It seems like he's still making the same decision-making mistakes, and he doesn't seem to really be having the impact he needs to have consistently. Yes, he may have a map here or there in the best of 3 where he looks really good, but it's not consistent at any level. In fact, he's consistently not having an impact. So I guess you could say it's not even a consistency issue. His consistency is that he's not having an impact. It's like an outlier when he does, it seems like. At least when it comes to LAN best of 3s. So I think a change needs to be made there for sure. As far as what that change is, obviously Skadoodle might be an option, but I feel like he's tied to Hiko, and whatever team Hiko's probably going to make. So I don't even know if Skadoodle's really an option at that point. So I don't know what they do, but I feel like that's definitely a change they have to make. Whether they need to make any more roster changes past that, I don't know. I guess it's possible you could consider another roster change there as well, but I think that one change could at least instantly have some type of impact on the team. Now, there's obviously bigger issues besides just that player. When Nothing did a post-game interview with Westerman there over at ESEA, you know, when they got eliminated by Nihilum, he alluded to like a slew of problems that they have with role identity and how they've tried to work on issues with role identity, yada, yada, yada. So it seems to still be issues with finding dedicated roles for each player on the team. This is kind of glaringly obvious as well because, for instance, if Shroud is their highest performing player right now, in my opinion. He's looked absolutely really good for them, especially on CT sides, especially on Inferno at the Pit, which is a map they've played quite a lot between Katowice and over here at the ESEA LAN. You know, they seem to play Inferno in almost every best of 3 that they played at ESEA LAN, and then it was one of the maps they played at Katowice in groups that they lost on. Shroud looked good. I mean, he's playing that Pit position really well on CT sides, and on T sides, I feel like there is a role issue there because I feel like sometimes Shroud is lurking on the opposite end of the map of the execution. I feel like some rounds Shroud is the first person into a site on an execution. So if I take Inferno, for instance, there's some rounds where he's like lurking in apartments or boiler or whatever. And then there's some rounds where he's at Banana being the first person into the site. And then there's some rounds where he's like the second or third person into the site. And he's like, I think that's the thing. They need to make Shroud comfortable because he is right now their highest performing player and to me the most consistent player that they have right now. And so they need to be kind of building around him and what he is comfortable doing and getting consistency out of him because he's kind of, to me, the lifeline of the team right now. And I feel like on T sides he should always be the second or third person into a site. he should be the guy cleaning up, after an entry man goes in, because he's good at cleaning up kills and getting kills. You don't want to be the first guy in, getting blindsided by a position he's not expecting, and then losing out on his fragging ability later in the round. He should be the second or third guy in. He also has pretty good clutching ability. He's one of the guys that does make good decisions in post-play situations and clutch situations. He's got very good decision-making in those clutch-type situations. So let him have the opportunity to clutch for you and be in the late round, which means he should not be the first guy into a site, and he also shouldn't be the dude lurking on the opposite end of the map where he might get cut off by a rotator and killed, or he's just not even a part of your execution because he's on the other side of the map. So I think that's just one example of a role identity issue I think that I see on the team, but there are probably more that you could come up with too on switching up who's lurking and who's entering and things like that. There seems to be some role issues there for sure. As far as leadership goes, I think Sean's a great in-game leader. I think he's the best in-game leader we have right now. Obviously, we've lost a lot of in-game leaders with bans, but I think even before those players were banned, he was still one of the best in-game leaders in NA, number 1 or number 2, whatever. I kind of alluded to the fact when I did my Katowice video about Cloud9, some of the criticisms I had there. I alluded to how it seemed like he would have good reads, but then someone like Simphis or someone else would overrule his read. So, for instance, against Virtus Pro on Inferno, at Katowice, there were many times where Sean was reading that they should go B because he knew Neo was playing it alone. He knew it was vulnerable. He knew that VP were just really just manipulating them by cutting off Banana early in their rounds and rotating a player to A and having 4 there and forcing Cloud9 into executing A when they have 4 players present. And he was reading this so really well, and there were several rounds where he was calling for them to switch back to B and actually attack in the B, yet Simphis or other people were saying, no, we should run this LDLC strat A or just whatever to hit A instead. And so he's like, okay, fine, let's do that. And then they would do that, and they would just keep losing rounds. And then finally, Sean sit there and was like, no, we have to go B. We cannot keep letting them do this. We've got to do this. And they did finally, do it, and then they won the round. And that was one of the few rounds they won on T-side against Virtus Pro. So that's just an example there where I feel like he's got good reads or good calls, and he obviously puts in the time to prepare and watch demos and scout teams and dry run strats with his team and practice with his team and teach his team strats and whatever else. But it seems like when it comes down to the actual live match environment, he's being overruled by other people's calls or what have you too often. Yes, he should get input from his other players. Yes, maybe their suggestions could be helpful to him, but he needs to have the final say at the end of every round. And maybe he is having the final say. Maybe it's his fault that he's not stepping up when other people are saying, hey, we should run this strat. Maybe he should be saying no more often. It seems like he does eventually say no when it's like a last resort, and he realizes that they need to make a change. It's like the last resort option. But I think that it takes him sometimes too long to step up and say, hey, no, we're doing this. This is my read. This is what we need to do. So maybe it's his fault for not stepping up more and saying no more when he's getting suggestions. Or it could just, maybe it's an issue with them not trusting his call. I don't know, but it seems like there's kind of an issue there. But that may not be even their biggest issue. Like I said, I think one of their biggest issues is role identity, which they seem to be trying to work on. I see them shifting things around between events, but maybe they just haven't found the right combination yet. And I think that Shazam, the investment just didn't work. Listen, here's the thing, everyone always gets their jimmies rustled in the community when someone talks about roster changes sometimes. They're like, no, they should just stick it out and work through it. And these are the same damn people, and they lose some fucking skins from a game, and they're just like, minus person, plus person. It's usually the same people, just given a different situation where they'll either be, hey, no, stick together, or hey, no, plus, minus. Yes, it is most of the time probably different people with those attitudes, but I feel like given the situation, people switch their attitude on that all the time. And like I said earlier, my attitude is of, no, I don't think you should make a roster change unless it's just glaringly obvious. Or if, and when I mean by glaringly obvious, I mean someone wants to leave, someone wants to quit, someone does not want to play anymore. Then obviously you have to get rid of that person because they're toxic to your team if they don't even want to be playing with you or whatever. Or if they're just literally no-shows in every single game, it becomes kind of obvious that they're just not performing. But in general, I'm of the impression that you should keep your 5 as long as you see potential, as long as you are seeing growth, or as long as, at least when you're losing, you see the mistakes that you're making and you're able to, see, okay, I can fix that with this 5. But I feel that, like I said earlier, once you exhaust your resources, or once you've plateaued, or in this case, Cloud9 has definitely slumped. Like, listen, at the end of 2014, everyone was talking about a Cloud9 slump, and I was kind of hesitant to agree because, you know, I thought they still weren't necessarily losing to teams that they shouldn't lose to. Like, so even at Katowice, you know, they lost to VP and TSM, which are teams that are ranked above them. So, like, on paper, if you hadn't watched the games and you just saw the score box and you saw, oh, Cloud9 lost to VP and TSM today in groups and didn't advance. Okay, that makes some sense. Cloud9's like a 10th or 11th place team in the world. You know, VP and TSM are like in the top 6 or something like that. So, yes, they lost to a team ranked above them. That's not really that great of a surprise. But then when you go back and you look at these games and you see the opportunities they had to actually win on these maps, if they had fixed some things, and not, especially against TSM on overpass at Katowice. There was, I think, 8 or 9, like 8 rounds or something on their T side in like 2v2 or 3v3 post-plant situations that they somehow lose because someone overpeaks or does something stupid. A lot of those rounds, I think, maybe you could credit to Shazam, but there was other people making mistakes there too. So my point is yeah, maybe if you look from afar and you're just looking at a score box, you would say, oh, okay, they're not that much of in a slump because they lost teams that you would expect them to lose to. But then you watch the games and you realize just how many opportunities they had to win, and they don't because of mistakes, and you're just like, man, they are kind of slumping a little bit. They're making so many mistakes. But even if you accept Katowice and Gfinity as not really a slump, still just losing to teams that they're supposed to lose to, but beating teams they're supposed to beat, then fine. But they're not growing, so they've plateaued. So that's still bad when you're at like a certain point, you're not growing for several months with the 5 that you have. And then obviously ESEA is just a slump. I mean, usually they've been able to beat Mouse Sports no problem. Now they've 0-2'd by Mouse Sports and couldn't get anything going against them. Then they got 0-2'd by Nihilum, a team that has only played 2 LANs together total as a 5, and many of their players have like almost no LAN experience prior to like CEVO LAN and this LAN. So, man, that's rough. And I mean, it's not even as if like it was close. Like, they got absolutely crushed on Inferno in the first map. Cash obviously a bit closer. But yeah, it seems like they've now went from plateau to actually falling off. And I think at that point, as much time as they've invested into this 5, it's probably time to make a change. And I've named one potential change. Maybe there's other changes you could think of. I'm not going to get into it too much in this video, but yeah, there's definitely some changes that need to be made there. I'm trying to see if there's anything else I want to say about Cloud9. We talked about role identities, talked about roster change, talked about the leadership thing. I think that's really probably the 3 biggest things, is issues with roles, issues. I don't know if maybe leadership's not as big of an issue as I'm making it out to be, but it kind of seems that way. And then I think that the whole Shazam thing was just, it's an investment that has not paid off, and I think now it's time to cut your losses on that and move forward in a different direction if you can. If you can grab a Skadoodle, that'd be great. Other than that, I guess it's still slim pickings out there on free agencies for oppers, but that's just me. Not trying to tear into Shazam, but I mean, like I said, it's just not working out. You can clearly tell it's not working out. So something needs to change on that team, and he's, I guess, the guy that's easiest to spot as the one on the chopping block. I don't know. Now, I'm not going to talk about Elevate or Liquid because there's no point. They didn't play any of these events. I guess Elevate technically played in CEVO LAN as an organization, but obviously it was 2 stand-ins, Hiko and Skadoodle, and not their actual 5. And then Liquid wasn't a participant in either of these events, periods, though they did do really well in FACEIT regular season. They're, you know, the first seed out of NA to qualify for the LAN event. Let's see how they do there. I'll probably do a video on them after FACEIT to see where they're at and where they need to go, because there are some criticisms I had about Liquid in the video I did previously, so be on the lookout for a new video on Liquid after FACEIT, as well as maybe Elevate after FACEIT, depending on what 5 they show up with. If they play with their full 5 at FACEIT that they played throughout online play, then maybe I'll just talk about FACEIT as an event for NA, maybe, like I did with Katowice. But let's entertain this idea of a Hiko Dream Team, or the idea of another NA Dream Team, just period. Hiko's already made it pretty clear that he's trying to put a roster together, that he's been doing so for a while. Obviously, you could probably point to Skadoodle being very much tied to him. I think that, I'm not going to say that out loud, actually. I think there have been some teams who have already tried to pick up Skadoodle, but Skadoodle told them no, probably because he's trying to make this team with Hiko, or he wants to stick together with Hiko, and either A, they make a team, or B, they join a team together, some type of, like, you know, 2-for-1 deal or whatever. Which is why I kind of think that Skadoodle to Cloud9 might be an issue, unless, like, Hiko is willing to rejoin Cloud9 and Cloud9 are willing to let him come back or whatever, which means that not only does Shazam have to leave C9, but someone else would have to, and who knows what that would mean. So let's just say, like, what team could Hiko put together? And obviously him and Skadoodle, but what other three could you get put the team together? Obviously, like, in-game leadership is tough. You know, there's not many in-game leader. There's no in-game leader free agents really that seem worthwhile in the NA scene. And whether you can jack a Sean Gayers or something like that, I have no idea. It seems very unlikely. But Hiko seems to be willing to take up the in-game leader role, and I think that could work. You know, if he actually wants to embrace this role, he does seem like a smart guy. He does watch a lot of CS. He does seem like he likes to do it. I mean, he was doing it at CEVO land for the Elevate pug, and he seemed to enjoy it, so maybe he keeps up with that. If that's the case, and you don't need to worry about another in-game leader for that dream team with Hiko and Skadoodle, you just need to come up with 3 more players to put on the team. I think there's like 2 different scenarios here. Either you have a scenario where Cloud9 picks up Skadoodle and that kills this whole idea of a Hiko dream team, or there's some type of situation where C9 picks up Hiko and Skadoodle and that becomes the NA dream team or whatever. So that's like one option basically. Or the other option is that C9 go in a completely different direction with what they're going to do with their team, and so you just have Hiko and Skadoodle making a team, and what can they get to make a 5? And I think that they seem to play pretty good with like Desi and Roka and Rush, so like any one of those 3 players are definitely players you could look at. For me, especially Roka and Desi, who I think would fit in pretty well role-wise on a team with Hiko and Skadoodle, and they've shown some good performances on LAN. Desi's been doing it for a while, though a lot of people have criticized his personality or whatever and his attitude, but whatever. He seems to get along with this particular group of people, at least from what I understand from talking with them at CEVO land. So even if he didn't get along with like the Liquid guys when he was trying out for them, or the Luminosity guys when he was trying out with them, or even if things didn't quite work out with iBuyPower back in the day or whatever, I think the big reason why it didn't work out with iBuyPower back in the day is because he couldn't go to ESEA land, so they had to get rid of him because they had to get a 5 for ESEA land, and he couldn't be a part of it because it's some rule or whatever. So yeah, let's just, Desi and Roka are definitely names. Desi, Roka, and Rush are all 3 names I would like consider at least for this team that Hiko and Skadoodle might put together. I don't really feel like anyone from CLG is poachable, so I'm not even going to entertain that notion. With C9, I feel like no one's really poachable there either, though Shroud, Skadoodle, and Hiko would be a pretty sick 3 to have together with 2 other players for sure. But I just don't see poachability there for C9. If anything, they would absorb like Hiko and Skadoodle if that's going to happen, rather than Hiko and Skadoodle being able to poach Shroud or something like that. Plus, I'm not really sure where Hiko stands with his idea on Shroud. I've heard him criticize Shroud's streaming and dedication, but at the same time, I've heard him praise his playing ability, so I don't know quite where he stands on that. And also, it seems like Hiko and Nothing aren't going to work out in a team together because Hiko doesn't seem to like Nothing's dedication or whatever either, so I don't know. I have no clue there. So who else could the Hiko Dream Team consist of? You know, I've named Desi, Roka, and Rush. Who else? Maybe, like I said, Nihilum has some poachable players now, in my opinion, unless they're going to like dedicate themselves together and not be willing to entertain other offers. But people like S18 and like Automatic are definitely 2 guys that are names that might look interesting to, you know, a team that Hiko's trying to create when he's watched them play at CEVO and ESEA, and he's seen some of the potential that they have, even though they don't have a lot of LAN experience. So that's definitely an ability there. What if things don't go right for Liquid at FACEIT? Are some of their players poachable? Are they willing to maybe reach out to Hiko and Skadoodle and make a team? You know, maybe you see a situation where, you know what, I think that if you would have actually seen like Skadoodle and Hiko willing to join Liquid back when they got rid of NAF and brought in a Liege, maybe you could have seen like a Dren, Skadoodle, Hiko, Fugly, Nitro on Liquid or something like that. Now that they've invested in the Liege, I don't guess that that's going to ever happen. Maybe they make another roster change, though, after FACEIT if it doesn't go well, and then they get rid of like one of their players, and then they might want to bring in like a Hiko or Skadoodle. But if Hiko and Skadoodle want to stay together, then that's probably not going to work out. But don't be surprised if like a Liquid player becomes poachable if things don't go right at FACEIT or in future events with them in the near future. Or if Liquid does not maybe consider picking up Hiko and Skadoodle as a package deal and getting rid of, you know, people. But I feel like everyone on their team to me is pretty solid over at Liquid. right now. Like I said, when they were definitely getting rid of NAF, maybe you would have entertained that idea of like a Hiko Skadoodle joining Liquid when NAF dropped, but they invested in the Legion. That moment seems to be over and gone. But maybe something changes in the future. I don't know. Other than that, like, free agents aren't really out there for them, I don't guess. That seem like serious options. Like I said, outside of poaching people from Elevate or trying to poach people from Nihilum or whatever happens with Cloud9 if that falls apart, those seem to be the teams that I think Hiko could draw a dream team from with Skadoodle and make some type of team. But I'm not going to go too much into that. Maybe I'll try to actually interview Hiko at some point down the line on a hype episode again or just whatever. But this video is already 50 minutes long, so I've definitely dragged it on pretty long. But I hope that I've like at least made some pretty good arguments there for you with some of these NA teams that I've reviewed. I wish I could do more because I feel like there's a lot more to say about Cloud9, but I feel like I need to gather my thoughts a bit more. I just wanted to put this video out there as like an initial reaction to what happened at ESEA and CEVO, but I think that it might be worth my while to either interview somebody or do a more structured video that focused specifically like on Cloud9's issues. Maybe it'll be more of like after they do make a change or announce that they're not making changes that I actually really seriously analyze Cloud9 again and just focus a whole video on them or something like that. But yeah, thanks a lot. Hope you enjoy it, and if you do, follow up and subscribe, spread the word, and I'll catch you next time.